All right, well, I want to talk a little bit about how we can do a little bit of hacking and forensics on the go. Phil Polstra, my stuff is on the screen there. So what's this talk about anyway? I want to talk a little bit about hacking forensics with small, low-powered devices. And in particular, we're going to talk about ARM-based devices, such as the BeagleBoard and BeagleBone. And I've got some fun stuff. I have a full suite of security and forensics tools that will run on this platform. Talk a little bit about porting these tools to a new platform, and also talk about USB forensics, now at high speed. Have a little bit more detail on some of this stuff in the workshop this afternoon that starts at 2. So if you want some help or you want to kind of get started with some of that, come by this afternoon. All right, so why should you care about all of this stuff anyway? Basically, what I have is a full set of tools, a whole pen testing or forensics kit that you can fit in a child's lunchbox. So it's pretty small. I have a full-featured Linux installation, which gives you a lot of flexibility. There's some other options out there. There are things like drop boxes, pony plugs, things like that, which are good and they have their place. The stuff I'm going to show you today is a little bit cheaper. Also, you have a little bit more flexibility if you have something that's small, low powered, so you can run it for days or weeks off of batteries. And at the same time, it is going to give you the flexibility of having a full distribution, not just a little special purpose device. Because they are small, you can easily plant these devices and come back to them later. And did I mention high-speed USB? Those of you who were at my talk last year know I talked a little bit about USB, but unfortunately, the devices I talked about last year were not capable of doing high-speed USB. So anyway, you might be wondering, who's this handsome man with a sexy accent, right? So if you were at last year's 4.4 you had way too much fun at the MWR party on Thursday night, because I had the first talk on Friday. So for the rest of you, I teach at a medium-sized university in Dubuque, Iowa, which I know a lot of you have no idea where Iowa is, but it's kind of in the middle of the U.S. Been programming since I was 8 years old. Been mucking about with hardware since I was about 12. I've also been known to fly and build airplanes occasionally. So, all right, so what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about how do you choose a platform for this sort of stuff, selecting a base operating system, where are you going to start, building that base, and then how do you build your tool set? So there's the easy part. You can always try. Find it, see if you can find it in a repository. If you can find it in a repository, that's the easiest. Don't kill yourself and compile everything from source, right? Sometimes you have to do that though, so that's the slightly harder part, right? When it comes to compiling things from source code, you have a couple options. We'll talk about those briefly. You can also build your own accessories. We'll do a couple of demonstrations, 6, and talk about some future directions. Okay? So choosing a platform, you want something that's small, low power, affordable, mature, has networking built in, has good USB support, and has convenient input and output options. Right? So that was my criteria, and the winner was a BeagleBoard. Right? Some of you, how many of you are familiar with the BeagleBoard? Right? How many of you are familiar with the Raspberry Pi? Okay, I know everybody here is familiar with Raspberry Pi. The biggest thing for the Raspberry Pi, it doesn't really meet my mature criteria because it hasn't been out that long. And also the availability up until very recently, especially in the US, has been poor. Even now, people are like, yes, I ordered one when it was first available, and I've been told my order has been shipped, right? So there's a lot of that going on. So I chose the BeagleBoard. It's 3¼ inches square, less than 10 watts, 125 pounds in chains at Farnell's. Interestingly, if you ever take a trip to the US, buy a couple, because they're only $149. If you do the conversions, that's a better deal. So that's a little under 100 pounds, I guess. They're based on an ARM Cortex-A8. They do have 100 megabits Ethernet built in, 4 high-speed USB ports, plus they support USB on the go. They have DVI-D, S-video, and LCD output options, so it's very flexible. You know, DVI-D and S-video, anyone that has a television, you can hook it up. LCD output, I have an example here where this guy is running a 7-inch LCD touchscreen, which is available for the BeagleBoard. Also, you have RS-232, webcam support, audio support, and you can run it off of a micro SD card. Right? So a picture of the BeagleBoard looks about like this. They come standard with half a gig of RAM, which is more than enough. They run at about 1 gigahertz, which is a little faster, a little more powerful than, say, a Raspberry Pi, and had some other reasons, not just maturity, why this was the preferred for these purposes. All right, so selecting a base OS. You know, there are a lot of options out there. Angstrom comes by default when you buy one of these devices. How many of you have heard of Angstrom? Yeah, it's not a real widespread distribution. Ubuntu. You guys ever heard? Yeah, everyone's heard of Ubuntu, right? It's one of the more popular ones. You know, some of the nice things about Angstrom, it's optimized for small platforms. It's optimized for ARM. It does have a nice package manager. Unfortunately, it's got pretty poor repository support for our purposes. You know, they don't, nobody else is out there saying, hey, I'm going to build a whole security, pen testing, forensics distribution based on Angstrom. All right. So my choice was Ubuntu. Ubuntu is available for the BeagleBoard and the BeagleBone. Backtrack, as many of you know, is based on Ubuntu, and it's pretty popular. So again, going back to make it easy on yourself. Right? If you can get stuff out of a repository, do it. Right? It's always going to be easier and quicker than building it yourself. So I chose Ubuntu. Now, normally the devices come standard with a 2 gigabyte or a 4 gigabyte SD card, micro SD card, and I have about 6 gigabytes worth of goodies. So you could run it on an 8 gigabyte card, but I say, you know, go big or go home, right? So I always use 16 gigabyte cards. So how does this work? You can install your base operating system one of 2 ways. You can go to Canonical's website and you can get an image for ARM-based Ubuntu, or you can go to Mr. Nelson's site and get his images. I chose to use Mr. Nelson's stuff because it's tweaked for the BeagleBoard and he updates it pretty frequently. Right? Like every couple weeks, you might get some updates and a couple little tweaks. A place where you can find some good instructions on installing the basic system, if you go to elinux.org/BeagleBoard Ubuntu, they have a really good tutorial on how to do this, and they'll tell you here are the options. Here's the easy way. Here's the slightly harder way, and here's the insanely hard way. All right. The other thing that's nice about Mr. Nelson's stuff is that he has some lovely install scripts that will prepare your SD card for you. And that can be kind of a hassle if you're trying to do that yourself. So, all right, so the easy part, once you have this all installed, one thing I will say, by the way, Mr. Nelson's stuff is great, and it has the script, and you get a wonderful tweaked command line only version of Ubuntu. And you can install the stuff from the repositories, but I think part of the reason he does that is it takes me an hour and a half to make one of these SD cards because it takes that long to copy 6 gigs of stuff. I actually kind of borrowed his install script, and his install script takes 15 minutes, maybe less, to install. So probably didn't want to copy an entire windowing system, but. All right, so a lot of these tools are available in repositories for Ubuntu. Some of them might not be in the standard repositories, but you can go to the project website and you get lucky, you find a deb file, right? And the deb file, it's not quite as convenient as being in the repositories, but it still works and works pretty well. Generally speaking, if you have something that's written in an interpreted language and you have the underlying libraries available, it's pretty simple, right? C-based libraries and tools can be a little bit more dicey. You might have to work a little harder to get those to install, right? All right, so if you have to install, can anyone identify the woman in the picture? Anyone know who that is? Bush. Which one? W? But, so you have to make a choice. Do you want to do a native install or do you want to cross-compile, right? So a native install is pretty straightforward. A native install, all you do is you download the code to your BeagleBoard and you build it, all right? Well, you're building it on a 1 gigahertz ARM platform with 512 mega RAM, which does great for running these tools. Compiling tools might take a little while. Or you can cross-compile. Take your octa-core, system with, 32 gigs of RAM and really put it to use. However, it's a bit more complicated, but you can do things quicker. Once you get it set up, it's really not that bad. So let's say that you want to go the easy route. Maybe you're just getting into this whole embedded Linux thing and you want to take it easy on yourself. You can build natively. Pretty much all you need is sudo apt-get install build essential. And by the way, it's build-essential, not essentials. That's burned me more than once. I'm like, where's this package? But, the other thing that I will warn you about, if you are using the BeagleBoard, the BeagleBoard does its Ethernet through the same chip that it uses for USB. And because of how that chip works, every time you connect, it serves up a new MAC address. All right? So if you're serving up a new MAC address every time you connect, your DHCP server, if you're using one, is going to give you a new IP address. All right, so just keep that in mind. The BeagleBone, the smaller device, doesn't have that feature, so you don't have to worry about it there, but just something to watch out for. All right. All right, if you're going to cross-compile, there are a couple of different options. Option 1 is probably the simpler option. You can download a tool chain, and here you can see where you can get one of these tool chains. I'm not going to go through all this in detail. We can talk more if you want to come to the workshop, and also it should be in the slides. So you just do a wget, download it, untar it, set up your environment, download your source code, and build it. Now, the only thing you have to keep in mind, if you do the standard source code build where you download, what do? Configure, make install, or sometimes sudo make install. So when you do the configure command, if you're doing this form of cross-compiling, you just have to add some options to tell it, oh, by the way, don't compile for this machine. Please compile for this ARM machine. Right? And the command is given here. Then once you've done that, you copy those binaries to your BeagleBoard and you pray, right? You run it and usually it works. Right? You might run into some issues occasionally. Typically those issues are going to be from things like, I have a tool that depends on a particular kernel version. That occasionally does happen, especially in our space and security. So you may run into a couple of glitches, right? And what's the best bet, honestly, if you run into that kind of a glitch? Native compile it. You can play around with it forever and try to figure out why it's not working, or you could just download it onto the board and maybe start it before you go to bed someday. It's not really that slow. Okay, I don't want you to think it's that slow to compile natively, but it's noticeably slower than on a quad-core machine. Other things you can do, option 2, you can install the tool chain and then use Eclipse. Install Eclipse. If you do install Eclipse, you want to install some of the development tools into Eclipse, download your software, and then you can use the make file from the project to create an Eclipse project. And you want to create the build configuration in Eclipse, compile it, and then move your binaries over, right? So in order to create a make file or project from the make file, there is an option in Eclipse to use a makefile based project, but guess what? That's probably not going to work because that makefile is assuming native compilation, right? Maybe you could tweak it. My preferred method is to just look at that makefile, see what the dependencies are, and create a new project. But you can do what works best for you. Then you have to create a build configuration. So you right-click on the Project Explorer and you tell it, hey, I want to create a new configuration. And then what you do is you alter the paths to things like the compiler and the linker. So instead of going to GCC, you would go to something like GCC-ARM, and maybe there's some stuff after that, et cetera, et cetera. I don't want to go through that in detail because everybody wants to see, well, what can you do with this anyway? A very good tutorial is on lvr.com, Lakeview Research. Jan Axelson runs this site. She has a little company not terribly far from me in the US. She's also very, very knowledgeable on USB stuff. All right, method 3 is the same as method 2. And what we do is you can add remote debugging capabilities. Right? Why would you want to do that? One of the reasons you might want to do that is you can easily transfer programs. Instead of having to S-copy or FTP, whatever you want to do to move your files back and forth. I guess you could put them on a flash drive too. You can use the Eclipse environment to directly copy your binaries. So that's kind of a nice to have. If it's something you're developing yourself in particular and you want to do some debugging, you want to do some remote debugging, you can also do that using this method. Right? Jan's site does cover in detail these last 2 methods. So I would recommend that you have a look there. But generally speaking, you just have to on your BeagleBoard, install a couple things. Make sure you have SSH installed. If you have the deck, it's definitely got SSH installed. And a GDB server for the debugging. Right? And then you manually SSH in there to your BeagleBoard once, make sure it works. set up your keys, and you go into Eclipse, create a connection, and then you have to create, this is a step that sometimes gets people, they forget they have to do this. You have to create a GDB init file and create a debug configuration. So, generally to create a connection, you just open the Remote System Explorer, you select connection new Linux, and you set up the IPs, and you can make a connection. You can store user credentials if you'd like to make it easy. And then, again, don't forget to create that GDB init file. Just touch it. And then you can create a debug configuration as well. A couple of things to keep in mind. And again, Jan's site has a good tutorial for this. You have an option for commands to execute before you run stuff. So there's this dangerous command, chmod 777. It makes your life a lot simpler when you're wondering, hey, why doesn't this work? It's not working because my program sucks, or is it not working because of permissions problems? Well, so if you do a change mod 777, it's because your program sucks, right? So at least you've eliminated something. And you set up paths and such as appropriate, right? Well, because these devices are very low power, you have different options when it comes to powering the devices. You can get plug-in adapters. You can also use batteries. And when it comes to batteries, one option is something like this. This is a pretty small, there's a big picture up there, but you get the scale. There's an SD card. Here's my compact power adapter, all right? So this is little more than a linear power regulator, a capacitor to smooth out power, a connector to the BeagleBoard, and two 9-volt battery clips, right? So the idea of this one is that you could put 2 batteries on it, but you don't need 2 batteries. You can put 1 battery on it, and if the battery starts to get weak, you put the second battery on before disconnecting the first battery, and that way you don't have to power down the device, right? There are other options. You could get like a lantern battery or rechargeable battery. There are all kinds of options there. Another option someone asked me about earlier this week is power over Ethernet. That's something you certainly can do. I originally, when I started thinking about this talk, had intended on discussing how you could build your own power over Ethernet adapter, and then I realized that that was kind of foolish because you can just go buy one for not a lot of money. So that is an option as well. All right, so let's say, why should you care? What kind of things can you do with this platform anyway? So I did a couple of demos. I do want to apologize somewhat. I used screenshots instead of movies or a live demo because, for one thing, we all know that live demos rarely work. And also, no matter how fast you think you type, as soon as you try to do 6 demos, you realize that half the demo is you typing. So I hope you'll forgive me a little bit. I'll use screenshot-based demos. If you want to see more live stuff, come to the workshop. And besides, those of you that are pen testers, do you use screenshots to prove that you did stuff? Probably, okay. All right, so for my first demo, I got my BeagleBoard-based The Deck system, and I had a 1-watt alpha card and a small 15 dB Yagi directional antenna. Hooked it up, and a little bit of music. Some of you might recognize that as a DEF CON 20 CD. And I thought, well, I got to do some basic, what's some of the most basic stuff you would do, taking little baby steps. And I went from there. By the way, this is my preferred keyboard for the device. The thing I like about this keyboard is that it's cheap. It's rechargeable, it's portable, and it's a keyboard, and it's a mouse, and it's even a laser pointer, all right? It's meant to be a presenter's pointer. I will say this, I've been working on this project for 11 months, and when I started, I never text, so I was not good at typing with my thumbs. Now I'm a lot better since I started doing this. So those of you that already have that skill should be fine with something like this. But you know, it has, of course, it's a wireless keyboard, so if you were to look behind the screen, you would see that I actually have a little plug-in for that. All right. Here is a screenshot of the LCD screen. As I said, there are many output options. One of them is an LCD touchscreen, such as this one that I bought that's available. You just plug it right in. And you can also do an S-video out. You can do HDMI out. You can do both. All right. I have done a lot where I will have this system with the touch screen, but then for you know, screenshots and things like that, sometimes it works a little better to hook it up to a monitor. It does work. The only caveat is sometimes you get a little bit funny tints because the BeagleBoard doesn't really like to drive two displays, and it optimizes for the LCD, not for your monitor. So, but it's perfectly usable, just a little bit there. All right, so this is demo one, which I call Chris John Riley. Anyone care to guess why? Phoenix once said that Chris John Riley is the MS-08067 of cons, and you know, I don't want to say this too loud because he's not here, but he said it's not a con if he's not there. But although there was speculation that he might actually be MS-08067, which would mean a live demo would definitely fail today. So what I've got is I've run a simple Nmap scan, and what do I notice? In the highlighted portion, I don't know how legible that is, I see, oh wow, I see a machine that has something on port 445, and I get all excited and happy, right? And I thought, oh wow, it might be exploitable. So on the right, I have MSF console running, and so we all know how to do this, use exploit, blah, 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 MS-08067, set up everything and run exploit, and boom. All right, there you have it. Shell created, I run my shell command and it reports Windows XP version 5. Not too surprising. By the way, does anyone else think it's kind of funny that the sub version number is 2600 on Windows XP? You ever notice that? I don't know, I just always thought that was a little bit funny. All right, so well, okay, Phil, that's not real impressive. You know, my 3-year-old son can use MS-08067 and Metasploit. So I said, well, okay, let's try a little Wi-Fi cracking. So here, you know, I'm doing the standard stuff. I'm running up AirCrack, so I run AirMon on my setup, and I was using one of these little 1-watt alpha cards. Again, still hooked up to my directional antenna. By the way, just a little tip. These 1-watt alpha cards are awesome. They have a new 2-watt card out. Don't buy it. All right. I bought one, and I ran into someone at DEF CON, and he said, oh, we stopped selling those because they're flaky and they overheat. He was right. He wasn't just trying to sell me something. I mean, he did sell me this card, but and the antenna. But so just a little tip. Don't buy them. They're green. Maybe it's a warning that they're green, but don't buy those. All right, so you know, once we've gotten that set up, of course, you're going to run AeroDump, and I look on here and I see a couple of networks. One of them, CIS, sounds a lot like my department at the university, and I see that they're using WPA2 encryption. All right. And by the way, just to give you an idea of the range with these Yagi antennas, You also might see Hardee's is being listed. Hardee's is a restaurant a half mile from my office. So it just happened to be backward from my directional antenna, but pretty good performance. So here, I ran AirCrack, and eventually I got the very secure password cracked of password 1. All right, so that was the WPA2 encrypted password. And again, further reminders that there is no patch for stupidity, right? You can't patch stupid. So if you pick weak passwords, you're going to crack them. Right. Speaking of passwords, I said, hey, why don't we try to crack some passwords on a router or two? All right. So fired up Hydra. Right. And by the way, the deck does have Hydra and X-Hydra. I'm a command line kind of guy, so I just fired up Hydra instead. And you see that once again, it has found for the login admin a password, which means that this is a default router that nobody set up. And it did that pretty quickly. All right, so, okay, well, what about those users out there that might have slightly better passwords? You know, it's not in the dictionary. Wow, that's going to make my life hard, right? It's not in the dictionary, so what do I want to use? I'm sure all of us have heard about some of the issues with WPS, and some folks about a year and a half ago, I think it was, discovered there were some fatal flaws in that protocol. So they decided they would write a wonderful tool known as what? Reaver. So they wrote this wonderful Reaver tool, and it will try to crack the pins. And of course, cracking the pins is a much easier situation than it is to crack the actual passwords if the passwords are stronger. By the way, I did want a disclaimer. Any of the passwords that you might see that correspond to networks at my university have been changed, all right? They were changed for these demos and changed back to something more secure. If you don't believe me, I guess you could always come over to Dubuque and try them. But anyway, so here we see Reaver running, excuse me, on our deck. It's running away. By the way, Reaver was one of those packages that obviously I had to build it from source code. The standard Ubuntu library repositories do actually have AirCrack, but not Reaver. So sure enough, I eventually found the pin and the password 1, okay, not a secure password, but I just set up this router temporarily with an SSID of 449. All right. So, number 5, what other kinds of things can we do with the deck? And I entitled this one, Pwn Windows 7 Like a Mac. You might be thinking, it should be like a boss, right? What do I mean, like a Mac? Early this year, around January or so, there was big news. What was the big news? 600,000 Macs owned, infected with banking Trojans and all these things. And of course, the problem was related to the Java virtual machine implementation. And so, there were some PC users that was like, yeah, take that, you smug little Mac people, which is not a good attitude to have. I mean, we should never rejoice when other people suffer. But At any rate, a lot of those a lot of those Windows users who were suddenly all high and mighty to their smug Mac user friends were like, well, gee, I'm sure glad I don't have a Mac. Did the Windows PCs have the exact same problem? They sure did, right? So that's why I called this one Pwn Windows 7 Like a Mac. So here, yeah, I guess it's somewhat legible. I ran up the Metasploit module for this Java vulnerability, set up my little host, right? Set it up on port 8000, gave it a URL, set my payload. In this case, I set my payload to just be a reverse TCP shell. And ran my exploit, grabbed a Windows 7 laptop out of the cabinet at the university, browsed on over, and boom, session created, interact with the session, and what does it say? Windows version 6.1, 7601, which is kind of strange since it's called Windows 7, but anyway, boom, it's like instant pwnage. And of course, at the time, this was a fully patched system at the time that I did this. One thing that was a little bit interesting, I have another personal laptop that the university issued me, which I was really happy. I got this laptop and it said Windows 7 on it. And then I opened it up and turned it on, and I found out they had regressed it to Windows XP to conform with the others who didn't have a Windows 7 machine yet. So I was a little disappointed, but my Windows XP box is a little bit more updated than some others. So at first I'm like thinking, what have I done wrong? Why can't I get it to work? Why doesn't it exploit? And then I realized, oh, because I actually patched my Java, and nobody else at the university had a patched Java virtual machine. So I just had to grab someone else's machine and boom, instant pwnage. So, all right. Now this last one is what I call the Click Kitty demo. All right. Trademark, me and Phoenix. What is a Click Kitty? Well, we all know what a script kitty is. Well, in the point and click era, you know, the GUI era, people can't even download people's scripts and run them because that's too much like work. They can only click on other people's interfaces. So we came up with this term Click Kitty to describe such people. So this is a screenshot of a tool that's known as the Fern Wi-Fi Cracker. All right? This tool just came out. It was discussed at DEF CON 20. It was released not on the pre-release of Backtrack 5R3, but on the actual release, which came out after DEF CON. All right? So how does this work? Any of you have experience with this tool? This is the ultimate Click Kitty tool. All right? You don't have to know anything. All right? Literally, let me think. Okay. I didn't have that bigger screenshot. Up at the top, initially you tell it which interface do you want to look at. You know, WLAN 1. Okay. Let me run Airmon for you. Let me run AeroDump for you and do all this in the background, and then it will come up with a list of wireless networks it found and the kind of encryptions they have, and you just click on which one you would like to attack. And here I clicked on one, and you see it's proudly displayed the password Cisco Lab 1 as the password for this particular network, which is pretty good that it got that fast because, you know, that's likely not in many dictionaries, but it was still able to do that. So yeah, that is the Fern Wi-Fi cracker. So it's a very very easy to use tool. I mean, literally my 3-year-old could probably use it, right? Okay, so right now you might be thinking, what the? I thought you said there would be forensics in this talk, right? Who's this guy, by the way? Jackie Chan. One of my favorite guys. All right, so a little bit about forensics, right? You know that I can't give a talk without talking about USB at least once, right? So what I did is I developed something I call the foredeck, which is just a little add-on to the deck. And it allows you to do USB forensics now at high speed. Some of the small devices I talked about last year had a limitation that you could only go to full speed. You can only go to 12 megabits per second, not 480, which is fine if you're dealing with flash memory-based devices because their write speeds are bad. As I said, it takes an hour and a half to make one of these one of these SD cards, copying only 6 gigs of info. So, you know, sometimes you might want to use an external USB hard drive or anything that you can connect by USB. And that could be an internal hard drive. I mean, there's many USB adapters available for different media, right? So I had this idea and I said, I should create a magical USB hub. And in my dreamland, everything that you plugged into this magical hub would just automatically get mounted as read-only. Okay? And being a software writer and one that likes to get down there in the details and, you know, have some fun, I initially thought, okay, I'm just going to hack those USB drivers in Linux, and this is going to be hard and it's going to be awesome. And then I realized there's a better way, right? And the better way is UDEV rules. I don't know how many of you are familiar with UDEV rules. They can be very powerful, right? So what I did was I wrote a couple of UDEV rules to handle when something is plugged in via the magical hub. I automatically mount it, and I mount it as read-only, right? So every block device downstream from the magic hub inherits the magic, all right? So how does this work? I mean, it's really pretty simple. I know you probably can't read this so well, but again, come to the workshop. And this year I did actually adjust some of the words to make it more appropriate for this audience. So you can select Z or S as appropriate, whatever offends you less. So I wrote a couple rules. So, you know, this is a basic rule that, you know, for those of you who aren't familiar with UDEV rules, basically what you do is you create a rule that matches parameters for your devices, and you put them in a directory etc udevrules.d and make sure that they end with .rules. And your devices will be checked for matches against these rules, and then appropriate things will be run. So, you know, here's the rule. There's a couple of scripts that are run. You know, I don't have the time to go through these in detail, but again, 2 o'clock, you can come to the workshop. And what ends up happening is there's a set of UDEV rules, and then there are 2 scripts. Those 2 scripts actually write other scripts. And it's because of the way UDEV rules work and when things are executed that's necessary. Basically, you get a match, but when you get the match, you're down here in the tree, but you're using information from up here, so you can't immediately try to mount the device or bad things happen. So, all right, just a little bit about some future directions. I want to continue to add any useful packages as the need arises. Basically what I did is I took everything that was in Backtrack 5, R3, and I said, is this something I would use, or is this just plain fluff? You know, there's a lot of those packages out there that maybe somebody uses them, but you know, what do most people spend their time with? Aircrack, Metasploit, and a few other tools, little password cracking. So, you know, as new tools come out, I'd like to add them. Maybe some optimization if there's some packages that run a lot. Maybe it would be time to go back to some source code and do some optimization. Some other output devices other than what's available now. I was really hoping to do a custom printed case. We have a 3D printer at the university. It is 95% completed, which makes it 100% worthless for printing anything. So unfortunately, the students didn't quite finish it before the semester ended in the spring, so I wasn't able to do that. There are several commercial cases you can buy, by the way. Possibly associate with a standard pen testing distro and think about maybe porting to another platform. You know, hopefully if you're thinking about doing something like that, maybe if you come to the workshop, we can talk about what's involved and you can get an idea for that takes. And with that, are there any questions? Yes, sir.
You mentioned Raspberry Pi. I mean, obviously, it's a new platform, it's only recently available. Would you consider Raspberry Pi to be the best BeagleBoard or potentially the BeagleBoard?
The Raspberry Pi is not as high powered as the BeagleBoard. It is cheaper. But again, I guess the question is, what are you intending to do? If you're intending to have a drop device, then you're right, the Raspberry Pi is cheaper. If you want a device that you can configure and then possibly drop, you know, I don't think that the Raspberry Pi is as good of a choice. I do know that there have been issues getting Ubuntu on the Pi. And again, it's what's the availability like? You know, at the end of the day, yes, it is cheaper. There are cheaper options. For example, here the BeagleBone is probably more comparable to the Raspberry Pi. It's a 700 megahertz processor instead of a gigahertz. You know, smaller size, less USB and all of that. So my thought is this, and this is something in my playing that I've done. I have like a small network hub, and when I've done things like I will take 3 devices, hook them up together, and work with them together. So I might have my wireless cracking going on here, doing something else, you know, maybe a little Metasploit action on one of the other machines, shell out to the other machine. But you know, the nice thing about it is, let's say that you use a battery to power this device. You shelled into it. It has the full distro, so it has all those tools available, whether you want to or need them for that day. You know, maybe another day you would. So you have all the exact same tools available across the different platforms. You say, hey, why don't you go out and try to crack a little Wi-Fi for me today? And you disconnect it from your hub here, you throw it in a bush somewhere, and you come back tomorrow and, hey, I just cracked 5 networks. So, and of course you could put your info on a thumb drive as well. So, anyone else? All right. So I guess I'll see some of you at 2.